Approaching the building and gazing upon these 24-foot-high walls, it's an immensely imposing experience. There's a distinct feeling that you are going to be unwelcome here.
This building looks kind of like a European castle or palace, but with a very gloomy and highly fortified aspect.
Upon entering, any faint hope of finding a fairy tale home rapidly disappears.
Inside, it's really not clear what this place is. There's a canteen with paintings, and upstairs there's even medical and dental equipment. There's something rather dark and sinister about it all.
In fact, this building has ties to one of America's most notorious criminals. And some believe that still stalking the halls are the spirits of those who suffered here.
When you get deeper inside, you notice the graffiti, the rusting iron bars, the peeling paint, and the feeling that terrible things happened here.
Clearly, this was never designed to be a happy place, and since it's all now falling apart and decaying, that just adds to the overall air of despair.
How would this place attain infamy? And what horrors remain lurking inside? Local historian Ryan Zacharel knows this vast building's dark past.
This was one of the most horrific places in the world, and still to this day it's notorious for the atrocities that occurred here.
In the 1860s, a series of escapes from county jails meant the new state of West Virginia needed to find a solution.
The inmates completely up and left and were never found. And it was at that point that they realized they needed something higher security. They needed something more permanent to contain the criminals.
The solution was this: the West Virginia Penitentiary. But this was no ordinary prison.
From the very beginning, it was designed to hold the worst of the worst. This place was supposed to be a fortress from which escape was impossible.
But in the 20th century, a frightening turn of events began putting pressure on these walls.
In wider society, ever more people were being convicted, and of increasingly violent crimes. The prison was designed to house only a few hundred people, yet it ended up with over 2,000. The result was uncontrollable violence.
To try and limit the danger, areas of the prison were sectioned off.
The premeditated slaughterings of their fellow inmates made this the most dangerous cell block in the West Virginia Penitentiary. They called this cell block the Alamo because they genuinely believed that they wouldn't make it out of here alive. They had to spend at least 22 hours out of every day locked inside these 5x7 cells, and they are absolutely tiny.
But locking them up didn't stop their violent tendencies.
It was all about survival inside this cell block, and survival meant arming themselves. They would cut pieces of metal off the doors or the bunks, and then once they had that piece of metal off, on the inside of their cell, they could bend down and actually sharpen that knife on the concrete, which you can see scratch marks right here, where an inmate turned that from a dull piece of steel into a deadly knife.
And the inmates weren't just trying to kill each other. Chuck Gent was a guard at the facility for 9 brutal years.
What happened was they was doing a survey to find out how hot it got in here, and they stuck thermometers up everywhere. The inmates stole them, broke it open, and stole all the mercury, and they tried to poison me with it in a cup of coffee. I got fortunate when I happened to glance down into the cup and found it. There wasn't a day you didn't come in here, you wasn't in fear of your life.
The horrors of this place have stayed with Chuck ever since.
You have flashbacks. When you see a guy with a 25-pound weight plate buried in his forehead, or a 12-inch piece of steel that runs up to his eye and up into his brain and out the back of his head. The guy set on fire and he's burning and his skin's boiling and stuff like this. You end up having a hard side to you to survive this.
But surprisingly, Despite the horrors that went on inside these walls, somehow this place became a public attraction.
94 men convicted of some of the most violent crimes were executed in a building called the Death House that once stood out here on the North Yard. They used to perform these executions by hanging publicly. People would literally travel miles to come and watch these executions. They would sell tickets to these, and people would bring their whole family. The kids would come, they'd have a picnic during the execution.
While the brutality of this place could certainly draw a crowd, it wasn't only the paying public wishing to come here.
There's this room called the Sugar Shack where prisoners could go. There was no supervision. The guards never went down there. They were afraid to go down there. And all kinds of terrible things happened. Some prisoners liked this setup. Some of them actually asked to be transferred to this prison because they knew they'd have more freedom to engage in drugs, violence, gangs.
Counted amongst those wishing to find themselves in this prison was one of the most infamous killers in American history, who also had a personal link to this site. In West Virginia stands the derelict remains of one of the country's most brutal institutions. It's a place that hides a link to a notorious criminal.
In the late 1930s, a woman named Kathleen Maddox was sentenced to serve time here. She had a young son named Charlie Maddox. This little boy came to visit his mother inside this penitentiary. This little boy eventually went on to become the infamous Charles Manson.
In March of 1983, the warden was handed a letter. Now, incarcerated for his involvement in a series of brutal murders, Charles Manson was requesting a transfer here.
There was no way the authorities were going to allow that. And the warden at the prison at the time wrote back, he said it would, quote, be a cold day in hell before Charles Manson moved to West Virginia.
Even without that killer being added into the mix, this place was already struggling to do the very thing it was designed for.
West Virginia State Prison was supposed to be a fortress from the very beginning. Just because they built it as an inescapable fortress didn't mean it was actually inescapable.
In November of 1979, we had the largest mass escape from this penitentiary. 15 inmates created a plan to smuggle in a firearm, take an officer hostage, get to the control panel, and eventually let themselves out the front door of this prison. The city of Moundsville was absolutely terrified.
Outside, an exchange of gunfire killed a trooper and an inmate. The other 14 escapees were eventually recaptured. This was just one of over 200 escapes that took place from the penitentiary.
Prisoners even joked openly about how easy it was to escape. The idea of an impregnable fortress had failed spectacularly.
Eventually, all the inmates would flee the appalling prison. The Supreme Court deemed the site unfit for purpose, and in 1995, its doors slammed closed for the final time. Today, decades after it was abandoned, the macabre site has become a mecca for intrepid visitors.
This penitentiary is thought to be one of the most haunted places in the United States of America. And one of the most common forms of supernatural phenomena is a shadow figure called the Shadow Man. In 2004, a lady named Polly Gear actually captured it in a photograph. She saw the figure walking towards her, so she took one picture down this hallway, and right in front of this door, the figure was standing, looking at her.
Even with the site's worst days long gone, perhaps the horrors of this place are still not quite over.